Bioware and Larian have both been successful in the RPG space. Bioware with Baldur's Gate 1 selling over 700,000 copies 7 months after launch, and in total 2.8 million copies. It was so successful it was cited as the reason for the revival of the RPG gaming genre. Bioware then went on to make many more games that either were just as good on their own or changed what an RPG could be. Knights of the Old Republic introduced a cinematic element to RPGs, including Dragon Age Origins. This trend of cinematic RPGs still continue to this day. Mass Effect would then popularize curated Protagonist as a mainstay in RPGs at the time. Both trends that Larian would even follow in time, to some extent, first with Divinity 2 Ego Draconis, and then Baldur's Gate 3. The effect Bioware had on the industry is not one to ignore, but that was never Bioware's intention. Baldur's Gate 1 was successful not because it was trying to be new and innovative, but simply trying to be a good game, and it was succeeded in what it was trying to do. Larian's success was a slow rise. Their first game, Divinity, was successful, gathering a lot of praise, but too many at the time thought it was a bit tad unoriginal and buggy. It was a mixture of many game styles from Ultima, Diablo, and Baldur's Gate. And on top of that, it was very safe in its world building, but, borrowing old tropes, and that isn't a bad thing. Larian continued as a small studio building their skills and knowledge until they released Divinity Original Sin in 2014. Kickstarter game that raised over $1 million, a game that was said by many at the time as the best classic RPG in years. This success, both critically and financially, allowed Larian to breathe a sigh of relief. Before DOS 1, Larian was considered a B-rate studio with a lot of cool ideas, but was one bad game launch away from shutting down. They had to work on smaller games like educational games to get on by, but DOS 1 not only allowed them to focus on making the games they wanted to, but put them on the map. DOS 1 put them on the map, but it was the Divinity Original Sin 2 that made them into a studio to keep an eye on. And with Baldur's Gate 3, Larian has fully transitioned into a AAA developer, accounting over 400 developers in multiple different countries. They've now become the size, scope, and scale and budget of a AAA developer. Whether Larian's game will affect the RPG space has yet to be seen. It's such a massive game, Baldur's Gate 3, that it is hard to imagine how people could make that game as well without Larian's backing and history with the tools that they used with it. Both studios are focused on the same genre, role-playing games, but emphasize the different aspects, and that is what I want to compare and contrast, to explore the differences and explain why they did what they did. I'll be covering each studio and how they did their protagonists, choices, story, world-building, dialogue, companions, gameplay, and progression. But before that, we have to understand that their intentions and overarching design philosophies are. So we will be looking at their respective design documents, or as close as I can get, and as I can't find the actual design documents for either studio, it's surprisingly hard for obvious reasons. They don't want to just release it out there. So I'll be using the closest thing I can get. A series of videos transcribed by philosophies with David Gator talking in depth about Dragon Age Origins development, and an excerpt from the book Bioware Stories and Secrets from 25 Years of Game Development of both Mass Effect 1 and Dragon Age Origins, and a pitch of Mass Effect 1. For Larian, I'll go off an interview with Sven Vinecki and GDC. Now, I won't be covering everything David Gator said throughout the videos because it is a lot and not all of it is too relevant, just the points that mattered. So from the Bioware book, 25 Years of Development, David Gator says, as one of the first developers on Dragon Age, writer David Gator was tasked with creating the entire world and everything from it in scratch. David had just finished work on the second Neverwinter Nights expansion, Hordes of the Underdark. James Ulm came and told me that Bioware was planning on 2 new games. One would be a fantasy and one would be a sci-fi. David said the idea was there would be their own intellectual properties. David was put on the fantasy property. James, the game's lead designer, gave David a historical atlas and set him loose, saying, go make D&D, but not. David says, I spent the first 6 months kind of holed up making the world. He said with a question, what are the things that they didn't like about D&D? They wished the things they wished they could change if they could. I don't like that the world of D&D has all this magic, but the setting doesn't acknowledge that it exists, David said. Every first level magic user has a charm person. If you met a mage and like them, you immediately should wonder if they are charming you. This is where the circle of magi came from, and its essential conflict between mage users and non-mage users that help to define the setting's politics. Now, Obviously, this describes a lot of what Dragon Age Origins is, which is a lot of world building. Not everything. Now, again, you could also notice that I didn't really talk about the characters within it, but we'll get to that point eventually. Dragon Age Origins started out with David Gator being asked by James Olm to make a fantasy world that was Bioware's. So David Gator went to work on creating that world. From this we can see, at least with Dragon Age Origins, that the game was designed with its world and story first, to the point where when the combat designers had ideas for various prestige classes and subclasses, David Gator said that they can't have that because it contradicted lore. Note, David Gator did say that he worked to some of the ideas later. The game revolved around its world and story, which is pretty evident as the first game introduced to the player is a lore dump, not in the negative sense, by Duncan, who had a pre-planned story death that the player couldn't stop or cause earlier on. The RPG staple of choices and consequences came after the story and world were established. Now, you may also point out that I haven't mentioned characters or companions in depth. Did David Gator simply not think that they were important? No. Throughout the videos he talked about the companions constantly, but when it came to designing the game on a macro level, the world and story took priority, but the characters are important. Which is clear in the Mass Effect 1 pitch throughout the book that covers it, The Final Hours of Mass Effect 3. The pitch mentions that the game will be an epic Bioware story, will be at the center of a powerful character-driven story. Bioware's intentions always seem to be that their stories and their characters. The same is true for the 25 years of development. At the core of Mass Effect was its story and characters, and the complexities with which players could engage with them. Some of the series' earliest writings was actually done in the development build of Jade Empire. As the first, there was no conversation wheel, Proto-Paragon and Renegade options existed as friendly and hostile, respectively. Command Shepard was an unnamed human spectre portrayed silently by Jade Empire player character Wu the Lotus Blossom. Players could converse with a handful of characters in the Mass Effect prototype. Many conversations tied into the player's choice about smuggling a weapon through Nevaria Station, a mission that made it into the actual game. In the prototype 2, a merchant gave the player their quest, referring to themselves as this one, another word for Hanar. So as you can clearly see that with this page, that, well, Bioware was very focused on its story, its characters. There's not a lot of mentions between these two of our choices and consequences. It seems like a lot of the emphasis is being placed on story, world, and characters. Looking at every Bioware game, the common thread throughout all of them is their focus on characters and world building. David Gator speaks about how much the development and effort they put into the characters. Bioware has always wanted to tell stories, especially stories through characters, but it often seems that the characters take priority over traditional ideas of what an RPG should be. A game about player freedom and choices and consequences. Dragon Age Origins sometimes just doesn't let the player do something because it would undermine the story or character development. The game uses this connection to pull on the emotional strings of the player. Would Duncan's death not be undermined if you could just kill him earlier? Because if the player could, his role in the story would have to be reduced in order for the story to function without them. Essentially, if you could kill Duncan or somehow get his death to happen earlier in the game when he was recruiting you, where does the player go next? That's a question that the game has to answer, and it's made less if Duncan isn't included into it. This use of characters and their relationships to each other is the core of Bioware games. The RPG elements come into play as to enhance the character drama. The player being evil isn't just an option. To be evil is to engage with the game's themes and characters. The player has to consider why they want to be bad and what they would mean to the game's themes and characters. The action of a player makes isn't contextless, it is put into perspective and is used. That is why when Bioware released Anthem, it didn't feel like a Bioware game, because it removed the characters Bioware used to make their stories good. And Anthem is at its best when it uses its characters. Owen is the player's friend, and they get to see their relationship change and evolve. So when he betrays you, it invokes so much betrayal, anger, sadness, which made the moment in the story where the player was weak even more potent. Now, this isn't to say that Bioware games don't have choices that are just for the player to make, but the majority of choices on offer are to enhance character drama or relationships or the story. In an interview with Sven Vinecki with PC Gamer, he talked about his love for Ultima 7. What he loved about the game was its immense freedom in how you can play the game, from solving quests in unique ways to the non-linear nature of the game. Sven adored that and wanted every Larian game to embody that idea. In a GDC talk on DOS 2, Larian talked about this philosophy called N+1 design. The basic idea is that the designers have to assume that the player can kill all participants in a quest and therefore come up with a fallback solution for the player to be able to finish a quest. This is most obvious in the main quest, where the player will still be able to finish the game even if they avoided everyone or killed everyone. An example of this design is in Baldur's Gate 3 is the Astral Prism in Act 1. In Act 1, the main quest is about finding a cure for the tadpole in the player's head. The player is given 4 quests to explore and find a cure. But if the player closed off those quests or just didn't do them, the fallback would be the Astral Prism, and how the Astral Prism would get into the hands of the player is also very complex. You could just kill Shadowheart for it, you could recruit her and it'll just be in your possession, or you could run all the way to the mountain pass, and then you would then trigger the trigger Shadowheart to bring the Astral Prism so that it could trigger the next part of the main quest. As in, when you're nearing the mountain pass or the goblin camp, a cutscene will trigger and unlock, as I said before, a new part of the main quest. Go to Moonrise Towers. The player may have closed off or refused to do any of the Act 1 main quest, but will still know where to go next. This N+1 design is prevalent everywhere in Baldur's Gate 3, and not just its quests. As also stated by Sven in an IGN interview, and additionally, the level design itself also has N+1 imbued into it. When going to the Blinded Village, you can cross the bridge or go under it. It isn't much, but it is an example that even situations where it doesn't really matter, it is still there. Larian likes to use the gameplay as part of the RPG experience, which Larian has used effectively. Baldur's Gate 3 is the game that is the closest to what a tabletop experience can be. But like a tabletop experience, it also lacks the characters that are important to it. In a tabletop like D&D, you can just have a party who does the main quest or who just doesn't and goes on random stuff. And the DM will have to accommodate that. We'll either have to have a way for the quest to still be relevant to them, or just abandon it and just allow the players to do whatever. That is what Baldur's Gate 3 replicated and done so successfully. Like what I said with the Duncan's role being reduced if the player can kill him, applies to all of Baldur's Gate 3. No character is needed for the story to function. To sum it up, Bioware makes a game with the intention of telling a story and then seeing where the player can make choices. Larian makes a game with the idea of giving the player as much freedom as possible, then designing everything else around that. With that out of the way, let's get to the rest of the video. Protagonists in RPGs do more than just provide context to the story and gameplay, but allow the story and gameplay to be interactive parts of the game. This type of RPG protagonist that Bioware and Larian uses are curated and blank slate protagonists respectively, each having their own reasons of existing. First off, let's establish what either terms mean. Blank slate protagonists are simply characters the player can make into whatever they want, whether it is a representation of themselves or of something else entirely. The point is that the game provides enough options for the player to make as many different kinds of characters as possible, and representations those options in games. And the more possible character types there are, the more liberating the player can feel, as they have the freedom to do what they want and act how they want, to essentially make whatever character they want to make. A curated protagonist is a character. They have an identity outside the player's influence. While it restricts what character a player can make, what it offers is a character that is related to the story, characters, and world. As often, these characters would have pre-existing relationships, whether that relationship is personal, ideological, or external. Whatever the relation to the story, characters, or world is, it can be used to make the character feel a part of the world and story. Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, having the player character be Gorine's ward and a Bale spawn, is crucial for a lot of the emotional beats in the story. But doing that restricts what the player can do with their character. They will always be Gorine's ward and a Bale spawn. They can't not be that. The player can reject or hate that part of themselves, but that rejection and hatred will always be in relation to them being that. To use my Duncan example again, having a less control over the playable character means that the character's history and character can be used and referenced throughout the whole game, meaning that if the player character in this curated protagonist can't just do whatever and isn't just beholden to the player's whim, it means that people like Duncan can be used again. Later on, during the Dragon Age Origins, you can get into a fate sequence, and one of the nightmares of the Wardens is you are in Ostagar with Duncan. And now, you can obviously react to Duncan in many different ways. You can still resent him, you can still be excited to see him, you can be suspicious of the circumstances. But Duncan being used there is effective because that's a character that the player has at least some relationship, positive or negative. It's not a character that can exist or can't exist. Now, the best way to see the difference of Bioware and Larian's protagonist is to ask, what can you do as the protagonist? Or what does the protagonist allow to happen? The answer Bioware gives to those questions is, as Commander Shepard, you can act and do as they do. You cannot commit an action that Commander Shepard would not do. You can't shoot at the Council, for example. Shepard's character won't allow that to happen. While the player can choose a background element like Shepard's history, space or colonist, or Earthborn, and what role they played in the Alliance before the events of Mass Effect 1, War Hero, Soul Survivor, or Ruthless, it still leads it into Shepard being a character separate from the player. All the backgrounds do is add some unique flavor to your Shepard, but that is just it, your Shepard, not your character. The same is true for all Bioware protagonists to some extent, even the hero of Ferelden. As the hero of Ferelden, you have a set backstory that can't be changed. As a human noble, you have a family, and one of the antagonists kills your family. You can react in many different ways to your family's death or the antagonist, but you can't change that set history. Another example is that the player is restricted from killing Loghain at Ostagar, as obviously the hero of Ferelden wouldn't have reason to do that, even if the player might want to do it just because. Now, the hero of Ferelden is more of a blank slate than a curated protagonist, but when compared to Larian's protagonist, Tav and DOS 2's custom character, it pales into comparison. Why does Bioware do this? Why do they limit what characters their players can make? The simple answer is for story and characters. Mass Effect 1, 2, 3 could not work with a blank slate protagonist. The plot moves forward because Commander Shepard wants to move forward. The plot goes into the direction it does because of who Commander Shepard is. Why does Commander Shepard just not leave to Ios instead of going back to the Citadel? Well, because it makes sense for their character to do so, to go back to the Citadel. And while that is limiting, it allows the story to be finely tuned for what it is trying to do. Blank slate protagonists can never have a story about them in any depth beyond, you so happen to be the only person who can kill the big bad, and also we're gonna coerce you into killing them. Nothing more and nothing less. While Shepard, being a curated protagonist, allows for the story to use them, an example is Shepard's relationship to humanity. Shepard can never hate humanity, they will strive to protect it, so the story can use Shepard's relationship to humanity to create conflict or interesting choices for their character, something that a blank slate protagonist could not do. Now, this isn't to say that Mass Effect does this expertly. There are inconsistencies with Shepard's characterization, such as it's a bit weird how Renegade feels more of the evil options rather than just a get the mission done at all costs than, just being evil. But it is clear that the game is better with Shepard than without it. The same is true for the hero of Ferelden. They are limited in what they can do, so the story and characters are better. Sure, such as the example I used before. The player can't kill Loghain the first time they meet him. The player can only kill who the developers allow to die, because it makes the story more coherent and impactful. Another way to think about it is that the curated protagonist can tell stories that blank protagonists cannot tell. You can't really tell a story with a blank slate protagonist with a personal relationship with another character that they have history with, because the point of a blank slate protagonist is for the player to make whatever character they want to make. Neither are better or worse, just that one can do what the other cannot. To have something more structured can lead to stories and characters to be more impactful, but also have the player be more in line with the story and themes, because the protagonist is in part a representation of the themes and stories. So what is Larian's answer to this question? It's a bit more complicated because throughout Larian's games it has shifted. Divine Divinity has pre-made characters similar to Diablo, while Dragon Commander had no custom character, having the player play as the son of a Dragon King who also was not voiced. So I will just be looking at DOS 1, DOS 2, and Baldur's Gate 3, as those are the games that Larian wants to make and is more representative of their newer style. So with that, Larian uses both types, but it is clear which type they designed first and focused on. As Sven mentioned in an interview that he views origin characters as replay value. Not that if you use origin characters for your first playthrough it's invalid, but he clearly states that he sees them as more of a, oh, just trying the story again but from a different perspective, not this is what you should do in the first run. The origin characters serve as the curated protagonists who have more ties into the story and world. The custom character, Tav, serves as the blank slate protagonist. You are given a list of options for your backstory and a variety of races and classes to choose from. The list is very extensive and provides the player many options to make many different kinds of characters. But Baldur's Gate 3 having both doesn't come without its consequences. The game was designed with a blank slate protagonist first and foremost. Why I say this is because the game functions without any origin characters. None of them are needed for the game's story or gameplay to work. All the origin characters could be dead or missing and the story will work without them. You don't need Shadowheart to save or kill the Night Sun. You can do both without her, because the game has to anticipate a blank slate protagonist for every moment in the game. Not only that, but one that can be alone throughout the entire game. If the player needed to be or have a certain character to understand vital aspects of the story, or to even complete the story, a blank slate protagonist would be worse. Which means Shadowheart isn't needed to free the Night Sun, nor is Lae'zel needed to free Orpheus. Those stories are made better with them and playing as them, but they aren't needed. The reason why these stories work fine without them is because it would inhibit what a custom character can do. They would be forced to be there for those moments, to not only understand what is going on, but to solve those issues as well. But the results of this game, it gives the players so much freedom in what they do. No two playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3 are the same. Larian utilizes the blank slate protagonist well, since the game allows the player to ally kill whoever they want. The choice allows a lot more characters to be made, as the characters the player can express themselves beyond dialogue. Now, why does Larian do this? It allows the player to be what they want and know the game will accommodate and recognize that choice, because Larian wanted to recreate the experience of making your own character and a DM ensuring that you have your moments, but also the experience of playing a pre-made character sheet that your DM gave you. And that is why Larian broadly does it. It's mostly to, again, emphasize and to achieve their goal of player freedom. So what is the takeaway from this? Well, Bioware uses creative protagonists because it allows for a much better story to be told, or at least a story that can be told with a curated protagonist, and not just, better, but also a more focused story. While Larian uses a blank slate protagonist, it allows for the player to move or change the story how they see fit. These restrictions, there are restrictions, but those restrictions are minimal. For the most part, the game allows for the player to do what they want, resulting in such a liberating experience. All stories are trying to convey something, whether that is a feeling or an idea, and for RPG, choices have to be baked into the experience. So you can't really talk about an RPG's story without fundamentally also talking about the choices it offers. But there are two ways to go about this. You either make making choices the reason you play the game, meaning the story is there to just facilitate the choices for the player to make. This is how Larian does it, while the other is using choices to enhance the game's story and /or themes. This is how Bioware does it. In Baldur's Gate 3, it is clear that the game wants you to make choices. It is always asking the player to make choices constantly. To reference the previous Sven article, he wants his game to be like Ultima, where the player has so much freedom to do what they want. The game story is designed this way, but also the entire game is made this way. The player can attack anyone they want out of combat or in dialogue, and it allows the player to also approach anything in multiple different ways. To enter the goblin camp, the player can either go through the front door, the roof, a small hole, or through the underdark. The game doesn't limit what the player can do, it just says do whatever. It perfectly recreates the D&D experience of how some players want to approach something. Some will sneak in to not be noticed, others will feign loyalty to enter, or some will join. It is very much in the moment choices and consequences. And since the game allows this huge amount of freedom, the story has to function without NPCs to guide the player. Important story revelations have to be delivered in ways that the player can't ignore, like before boss fights or by characters who can't die like the Emperor. which is not only unique among a lot of other games, but also bakes choices into its very core. It offers the player story freedom and mechanical freedom. What this means is that the story will offer the player the greatest number of choices it can within its story. Act 1 allows you to side, betray, or kill anyone you want whenever you want. You can side with the goblins for a bit, then betray them last minute, or be a free agent and just do it because that is what you want to do. You can even ignore the entire story of Act 1. This remains true even in the second and third act. The second act allows you to again side, betray, or kill whoever you want whenever you want, and so goes for Act 3. Even if it isn't the same as Act 1, it still offers as many choices that other games wouldn't have allowed. But this isn't without its consequences. Offering the player as many choices as possible whenever doesn't mean the game's story will suffer, because at the end of the day it is just a background element. It's there for the player to make choices in and not much else. The story is only important as so far as it allows the player to make choices. Contrast this with Bioware, and you can see the games are designed with in-the-moment choices and consequences. The player can decide to kill anyone and they want, nor do they have many options to approach a situation. During the main quest to recruit the Danish elves in Dragon Age Origins, the player has to get past the fog. The fog is impenetrable. There's no way through it or around it or any other solution. The only way past it is to side with either the Grand Oak or the Mad Hermit. They will give you the item to get past the fog. If Larian designed this, they would have had the former but added other ways to get past it, like you could shapeshift and go under it, or you could steal it, or some other manner of ways to get past it. But Bioware didn't. The reason for this is simply so the player explores and understands what the Brazilian forest is like. Back to the choices. With this in mind, you can start seeing a pattern with Bioware choices, that the player makes the choices at the end of a storyline. To use the Danish elf main quest again, you can side with the elves or werewolves at the end of the quest line. Same is true with most of Bioware's quests. The reason for this is so when you make the choice, you are making an informed decision. The player can't just go right into the Danish elf camp and just murder everyone and then side with the werewolves. They can't do that. They need context for why they should do that, not just they can do that and let them do that. Larian allows the player to decide who they can side with at any time, including the times they have no information. The biggest reason as to why Bioware does this is to use choices to enhance the story and characters at play, and also for comparing and contrasting. It isn't offering a choice for the sake of it, it offers choices when it can be used to make the story better. It's a lot more restrictive on what the player can and can't do. You can kill whoever you want or ignore story beats. You are forced to engage with it. When making the choice to decide who should be King of Orzammar, the player knows that both kings will be given what they want, an army to fight the Darkspawn. So then it turns into what is the reason to choose one king over another. That question then starts the player to think long term of how each king treated them. Bioware's choices ask the player to think long term or reflect on their characters, while Larian is very much more in the moment choices and consequences. There's a lot more reactivity with Larian because there's a lot more immediacy to it. You do something happens immediately. Bioware doesn't do that as well, and is more asking think long term, not short term. Stories in RPGs are different from other games because they have to account for the fact that the player can choose the direction of the story that it goes in, which makes the story in question different because it is interactable. You don't have a story like Uncharted be an RPG because the characters and plot points aren't made with choices in mind. Nathan Drake can't be anyone else but himself, and you can't change the plot because each step is needed for the story to be cohesive and to tell the story that Nathan Drake is part of. Now, you may say isn't this familiar to what I said previously in the previous segment? Certainly, but this is now focused mostly on the stories themselves rather than how choices in the game influences it. Bioware and Larian allow the player to bend the story to different degrees. As I said in the previous segment, Bioware and Larian give a certain amount of choice to the player, which affects how the story is made. Larian's stories are very bendable because, as I've said before, Larian wants to make a game that gives the player a lot of freedom and is a representation of a D&D campaign. Let's take a short examination of the game itself to show what I mean. After the Norloid crashes The player's next objective is to find a cure for the tadpole in their head. How the game goes about this is where its player freedom and D&D DNA comes in. The prompt is find a cure, and there are many answers to that prompt. Over the course of the act, the player will have 4 ways to find the cure. The player can determine which path they wish to take and how the path will develop. Perhaps the player will be diplomatic or murderous, or think that everything offered doesn't suit them. What this means for the story is that it has to think on what the player can do and where they can go, because it doesn't limit the player on where to go and what to do. The player can complete the main quest in any order they choose, or don't complete them at all. So the story is simply the context provide a base of the choices and consequences. The story serves and supports player freedom. The game is meant to have a lot of player freedom, and the story reflects that. But to get to the story itself, it's simple, with a large amount of plot twists and revelations. The story is basically big bads wanting to rule the world, while behind them is a bigger bad. The only thing to comment is that the story doesn't really explore its themes or concepts a lot. Now this isn't because Larian lacks talent or effort to do it, it's simply because player freedom changes what the player sees, so things like themes of abuse can be lost or less impactful because the player could have done something that made it that way. And that the story doesn't need to do that because it isn't required to facilitate player freedom. The story just needs to be understandable at best. With Bioware this isn't the case. Bioware stories aren't easy to bend. They have a set direction with required goals to meet. An example of this is in DAO, where you can't kill Logain the moment you meet. The player meets him 2 times in Ostagar before the battle in his tent and when the battle is underway. Both times you can't kill him, because he is needed for the story to work. Logain abandoning the king and falsely blaming the wardens is what creates a lot of the tension and conflict for the game. Being able to kill him would make this story different, or would have to force the story to make Logain's role reduced, having some stand-in for Logain if you kill him so the story can still function. But again, these restrictions on when and where you can make a choice allows for the story to express itself fully, given a better sense on what is happening. Another example is when the player recruits the data shells. You can kill them then and there, you have to wait until you meet the werewolves and are given the option to kill them. Why this is the case is because the whole story of the game is to build an army to defeat the Darkspawn. Killing the elves as you meet them would go against that story. Bioware made it this way deliberately. They knew making this kind of story would have to restrict the player what they can do, as opposed to Larian. In Bioware games, the choices and consequences serve the story, they're not the point. But for Bioware, stories themselves is pretty simple, something they share with Larian. The difference is that Bioware explores their themes concepts with the story. Since the player can't really change how the story is presented, the player freedom through player freedom or missed story beats, the player has to engage with them. Dialogue in RPGs is the main way to express the player. It allows them to define who their character is and is not. A lot of dialogue differences between Bioware and Larian are minimal, but there are very key differences. Bioware has a lot more dialogue options for exposition and questioning. If you played through any Bioware game, there is just a lot of talking about everything or anything relating to the character you are speaking. And not just one character on one subject, but multiple different characters with different perspectives on that one subject. Take the circle during the Mage Prologue. You can't just talk with so many different characters and each of those characters have different point of views on the subject. All the mages provide their viewpoints on what the circle is and what it should be. These are called the fraternities of enchanters, where enchanters with similar views gather and use their voices to influence policy of the circle. And in Dragon Age Origins, the player gets to talk to the members of those fraternities, Aquitarians, Libertarians, and Isolationists. We understand not just what the circle is, but we see how the people inside it operate because of it. Well, Larian doesn't do that. They don't allow the player to talk about the character they are conversing about, anything beyond the quests that they are associated with. Take Zevlor for example. Zevlor is a tiefling from Elturel and is a Hell Rider. The player can ask him what those means without prior knowledge and on what those elements are. The player only knows it's on a surface level. Elturel are where these tieflings are from and was sucked into the hells by Zariel, Hell Riders are elite warriors, but if this was a conversation in Dragon Age, you could spend 10 minutes with Zevlor talking about his life in Elturel and as a Hell Rider, then spend 10 more minutes talking to other tieflings with various perspectives on Zevlor, Hell Riders, and Elturel. Larian uses their dialogue just to get the point across and move on. There isn't really anything else there. This difference, while big, doesn't affect Baldur's Gate 3 as much. The game's dialogue isn't the only way for the player to express themselves, and that those extra dialogues aren't really needed. It's cool added flavor to understand who these characters are, but for the moment it's not really relevant to understand them or the world that they live in. It's not needed for the story to work, and it's not needed for the quest to function. The player doesn't need to know what Elturel is, it's a side point, and the same can be said about Bioware. The player doesn't need to know about the world, but it does lose flavor. One of the big things that are great about RPG dialogue is that the questions and exposition is given only when the player demands it. It makes learning about the characters in the world feel more natural. But this difference makes Bioware games tend to be better at world building, while Larian games tend not to focus on it. Larian has a lot of cool ideas in their world building, but it's mostly just ideas and not really something fleshed out. Another difference is clarity. Bioware uses the dialogue wheel. Left side is for questions and the right side is for responses, answers, and continue the conversation. The design influences how the game does its quest and story. You'll get a moment to discuss with the character on what they are doing and why they are doing it, or other questions related to relevant to the situation. While Larian is a lot more confusing, not in a bad way, but in a way where the player has to deduce what an option does and find out what it means. And when figuring out the system, it tends to be a fact that Larian's dialogue is usually responses and answers. It wants the player to be always moving. The questions that a player can ask is surface level and only somewhat relevant to what is being said. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Larian's dialogue wants to be continuing, doesn't want to hold on. As I've said before, the game doesn't allow the player to have a chance to ask many questions, even in situations where it isn't that dire. These differences change how the games work. Bioware wants you to be immersed in the game. They want you to explore and find out about everything in the game, which is always evident due to the Codex, an easy and accessible way to explore the world more in depth. While Larian wants you to engage with the systems of its games, dialogue isn't emphasized because dialogue isn't the only way to express yourself in the games. Larian allows you to use gameplay to express yourself narratively, where Bioware won't let you kill someone unless they say so you can, and only do it through dialogue. World building is a huge part of RPGs, as one of the appeals of an RPG is exploring a world that the player inhabits, or to be a different kind of character that can only exist with wizards and dragons. How Bioware and Larian do this is, as discussed so far, different. Larian isn't interested in world building. This can be demonstrated by DOS 1's and DOS 2's opening cutscene
In the days of old, the sorcerers of Rivellon cured the sick and healed the wounded through a great power called Source. But a terrible darkness invaded the land, and Source was forever tainted. The sorcerers who once healed now only destroy, and madness has overtaken them. A few brave Source hunters are all that stand between Rivellon and the dark power that threatens to destroy it. Wherever Source appears, hunters follow.
Rise and shine, Master Source Hunters. The captain wants you up on deck. Hear them gulls? Means we're close to shore. Don't ever you go in there, Master Source Hunters. City's full of undead, hungry enough for blood. But you're supposed to investigate that murder, ain't you? They say it's Source that did the Counselor in. Source in a city like Sicil. Nowhere safe anymore. Here they are, Captain Sir.
God's blessings on you, hunters. You'll be happy to hear we've reached Sicil. But there's trouble offshore, so we'll have to sail in carefully. Here, have a look. Those are orc ships, and they're blocking our passage. We'll get you as close to the city as we can, and drop you off at the beach. Be wary now. Orcs are on the attack. Undead have closed every route out, and there's a sorcerer on the loose. If we're to get justice for the Counselor, you'll have to keep your wits about you. May the luck of the gods be with you both, Source Hunters.
Here. Now, I do want to say that they're not bad at world building, they're just not interested in it. They're not someone who wants to go through it. And as we go through, DOS1 explains the source is being misused by people and is also being corrupted. So as hunters are now hunting those people who are corrupting the source. Simple enough, but leaves many unanswered questions. What is source? Magic, presumably. What does source do? Magic, but what kind? Where does source come from? What are source hunters? They hunt source, but who makes up the source hunters and how do they form? How was the source corrupted? And other questions such as how has source affected other people? Can we be shown this? It's fine to leave questions, but not answering some of them leaves a lack of understanding. It also means that the answers to some of these questions don't lead to more questions, but because how a question is answered can lead to more questions. It doesn't really establish the threat of source and what it has done. It just simply tells the player that source is being misused and you are going to, hunt these guys.
It all happened like I knew it would. A single drop of source magic. And, like flies to honey, the monsters swarmed. The rebel panicked. The carnage began. And the Magisters pointed their fingers at me. Just as I'd planned. I was shackled and collared and sent to Fort Joy. I'd come here to kill Godwoken. But instead I became part of their story.
DOS2 explains that a lady misused source to attract monsters to intentionally get herself captured by Magisters so that she can kill a Godwoken. Same as DOS1, it doesn't answer much. It mostly just states what is happening. What is source? Magic, presumably. What does source do? Magic, but what kind? Where does source come from? How are monsters attracted to source? What is a Godwoken? What happened to the source hunters? What are Magisters? What does the lady want to kill a Godwoken? The game did what DOS1 did and not really answer or establish the threats and stakes going on. Now in each respective game the answers to these questions are there, but what the game decides to show the player in the opening is what the developers think is important. And for Larian the important thing is that you should know that there is this thing called source. Larian made short intros to explain that just something is there and to get the player into the game as quick as possible, because they want the player to focus on the freedom aspect of their game. And throughout the game the player doesn't really ask questions about the world and more so just gets told the important bits. A lot of the answers given don't lead to more questions. And as for Baldur's Gate 3's opening cinematic, I'm not going to really blame Larian for this since this is a different setting and not their own, but I do also see the same trend happens. What happens in Baldur's Gate 3's cinematic? A squid kidnaps a bunch of people including you, and then it gets hunted by green frogs. Like, that is all that happens in that cinematic, and it doesn't really portray who is like the big bad, why the big bad, what is their history, origins, or anything like that.
The Chantry teaches us that it is the hubris of men which brought the Darkspawn into our world. The mages had sought to usurp heaven, but instead, they destroyed it. They were cast out, twisted and cursed by their own corruption. They returned as monsters, the first of the Darkspawn. They became a blight upon the lands, unstoppable and relentless. The Dwarven kingdoms were the first to fall, and from the deep roads, the Darkspawn drove at us again and again, until finally we neared annihilation. Until the Grey Wardens came. Men and women from every race, warriors and mages, barbarians and kings. The Grey Wardens sacrificed everything to stem the tide of darkness, and prevailed. It has been 4 centuries since that victory, and we have kept our vigil. We have watched and waited for the Darkspawn to return. But those who once called us heroes have forgotten. We are few now, and our warnings have been ignored for too long. For I have seen with my own eyes what lies on the horizon. Maker, help us all.
While with the Dragon Age Origins opening cutscene, it does a lot more for the world building of the game. The game opens up with a quote from the game's fictional world religion. That gets answered later. The mages caused the city to blacken and the Darkspawn came into the world, but just before it, the intro says, "The Chantry teaches us," implying that this is a perspective from the Chantry, and not necessarily the truth. After the mages were cursed and cast back out into the world, they ravaged the world, setting them up as a huge threat that is emphasized when playing the game. The player going through the deep roads knows that this was once part of the Dwarven Empire. The Darkspawn were defeated by the Grey Wardens. The Grey Wardens being men and women from every race, warriors and mages, barbarians and kings. The Wardens is made up of anyone who wanted to fight the Darkspawn. Then saying the victory was 4 centuries ago establishes a lot, because then it shows perspective that was a long time ago, and also sets up other things. And because it's been a long time, the world doesn't listen to them anymore. But another bite is going to happen. It ends with a speaker, Duncan, saying, "Maker, help us all," which clues us into more terminology of the world. The intro does so much for the world building of Dragon Age Origins. It shows us an origin for the Darkspawn. It shows us the Darkspawn as a threat, not only in the past but in the present. There is a weight to seeing what happened before and knowing it's happening again. It is also not only answers questions but on what something is, but then the answers lead to more questions. The Chandra teaches us, which begs a question on other versions are there for the origins of the Darkspawn. Another question is what makes the Grey Wardens different? How were they able to defeat the Darkspawn where others could not? And a host of other questions. But allowing to answer some questions and having those questions lead to more questions allows it to feel a lot more in depth, a lot more captivating. Bioware values its world building a lot, but also knew that for its story to work it needed to establish a lot so the player can understand it, and when allows to ask questions to get more information. Companions are stable in many RPGs because they extend the choices inherent of an RPG into them. You can mechanically change the companions to fit your needs, or you can influence what direction their lives take. They also give you insight about the game world, so it's no wonder why many RPGs have them, because they do so much. The difference between Bioware and Larian's companions come down to a few key differences. As a whole, they fit the story and themes of their respective games, give the player insight into their game world, and the player can influence them. They are the same in that respect. The difference is how they go about that, doing and how important they are to the story. Larian's main goal, as I've said many times before, is player freedom. Therefore, some people may not want to have certain companions or just not want any companions at all. Every companion is therefore optional, which means that whatever role they have in the game has to be reduced so that their absence doesn't affect the game that much. Which also means their impact is less. The game has to be understandable with and without them. It's deeper and more satisfying with them, but they aren't so crucial or vital to the game working that they need to be there. While Bioware also has optional companions, it's never a good idea to not have them. What I mean is that the way companions are made with Bioware games is that their quests aren't woven into the main story. They may relate to the main quest or progress with the main story, but it's not like how Larian does it. None of the companions have quests that aren't a part of the main quest or aren't woven into it. They don't have quests that are just unrelated to the main quest. Shadowheart, for example, has her companion quest woven into the main quest, while Liliana isn't. Her companion quest isn't relevant or related to Loghain or the Blight, so if the player doesn't let other companions join them, they are just missing out on content. While in Larian, you can still engage with it, with or without the companions. This is not even considering that Bioware as a core of companions you cannot get rid of or have to put a lot of effort to get rid of, which leads to how impactful the companions are to the story. Bioware's core companions impact the story in a major way. Alistair can be King of Ferelden, and Morrigan gives an out to Dine to the Archdemon. Removing them from the game will leave a vacuum in its place, while if you remove a Larian companion, nothing really changes. They don't have an impact on the story because the story can be accessible to the player, meaning that the companion's impact in the game isn't that much. Having them there and not there doesn't change it fundamentally. There will be a different experience if the player takes all the companions, but not at the core level. While Bioware does definitely have companions who don't impact the story that much as Liliana, the difference is that Liliana's quest isn't woven into the main quest, meaning if she is there and not there, you're just missing out on content. Another difference is that Larian's companions are cagier on discussing their past, and not in the ask me when we're friends kind of way, but more in the they don't have anything else to say. Where do you think the reveal that Asterion was a corrupted magistrate comes from? Not in the game, but in a book. What Asterion implies can mean he was corrupted, but his dialogue can be open to interpretation. The Gur could have just been different people. It was 200 years ago, a lot could happen, so they could have been angry at a sensible law, or Asterion could have been in a wrong place at a wrong time. Asterion sounded uncertain that the Gur could have killed him because of that law. It could have simply been that these Gur just wanted to kill him. The issue here is that the player can't ask for clarification, like, what law do you think caused this? And this lack of clarification leads to the companions having very vivid broad strokes, but the details aren't developed. Now, I do have to say that not all companions are like this, and some companions are better, such as Shadowheart, but that is mostly due to the fact that she doesn't have a good memory. You know, the whole Sharon memory wiping thing? While with Bioware you can just ask them about everything, not literally everything, but everything that is important to their character, and as the game progresses and your relationship with them continues on, you get to learn more about them. You're forming a relationship. You only get to know more if you put in the effort with them. Their history, their thoughts on many different topics, and what they think about other companions. Now, just like with Larian, not all the companions are made equal, but Bioware's companions have a lot more to say about themselves. Alistair gives us a lot about his childhood, his time with the Templars and Wardens, and eventually his feelings on being the heir to the throne. The player just gets to know so much about them. And there is no much to say beyond that, because it is pretty self-evident that Bioware companions are just more talkative, and this adds a lot of flavor to them. Getting to know who they are and what they think about the different topics and things and what you're doing makes them flavorful. Baldur's Gate companions can do that to an extent. They'll comment on main quest progression or companion progression, but it doesn't feel as similar to what Bioware does because it's not in the moment. And additionally, you can't ask them questions on what they think about that. Now, it may seem like I'm making a quality statement here. Personally, I do like Bioware's style more, but I am simply showing what is the difference between the two styles. It's up to you to determine which you like more and which you don't. And I am simply saying that they both have strengths and weaknesses. Larian chooses to do that because it works for their overall design, that being player freedom, while Bioware chooses to do what they did because it works for their overall design. Ultimately, there are more similarities to the companions than differences. They all follow the same general guidelines, relevant to the story in some way, representing and/or adding something to the world or story. They can be influenced by the player, they have a reason to join the player and a reason to stay, but the differences are still there. Gameplay in RPGs is hard to quantify because the range of gameplay styles range from hard, crunchy, turn-based games with many abilities to real-time combat where reflexes are important. But the core idea with each of those styles are progression in character expression. Progressing the player's power from struggling to kill low-level enemies to killing demigods. Character expression is the style the player wants to embody. The classic warriors, rogues, and mages come to mind. They offer three distinct archetypes of how the player wants to express themselves in the game world, and can also be adjusted for sci-fi settings, such as with Mass Effect's soldier, biotic, and tech. So what is there to compare between the two different studios? Not much. Bioware and Larian both have player progression, starting out killing low-level enemies, but ending up killing powerful beings. Most RPGs do this, and technically all of storytelling does this. Start out small, end off big. There is some distinction progression style between the two studios, like Bioware has the player kill rats and normal people, while Larian gives the player fantastical creatures to kill first. But those aren't so drastic in terms of gameplay, but those are more storytelling and world-building choices. The only thing to compare is how each studio does character expression. Bioware is a lot more controlling on that front, having settled into the warrior, rogue, and mage triangle. Dragon Age Origins has 3 classes and only 12 subclasses. Those subclasses also existing depend on what the story allows for it. If Morgan wasn't a shapeshifter, the game wouldn't have the player be a shapeshifter as well, which is probably the lore reason and story reason why Arcane Warrior never made a return. It's explicitly an elf thing that can only be found out because there was an Arcane Warrior soul that you could learn from, because Bioware asked that question on how the player can learn the subclass, while Larian, on the other hand, has 12 classes and 46 subclasses. There's not only a far more, but it's a lot more varied. You don't just have a rogue, then a subclass sneaker rogue, though you can do that as well. You have magical rogue, you have bard warrior, and a lot more. The classes are just broad descriptions, but things baked into the world, and likewise the subclasses. The story has no impact on what subclasses become available or not. And the last thing to compare and contrast is progression. And what I mean by this isn't the 0 to hero I mentioned before, but how the story goes from plot point A to B, and what the player can do in between those points. Now this is very different for RPGs, as in RPGs you can sort of choose where you can progress with a story. Larian is one of the most non-linear studios I've ever seen. They don't just allow the player to decide which path to go on plot B, but also to skip plot B and go to C. The games also have a lot of skippable content in them, not just in the side quest, but in the main quest. Act 1 can be entirely skipped, resulting in the player going into Act 2, and each act allows for a majority of its main quest content to be skipped as well. If the player knows the location of someone or an item, or just wanders around enough, they can go get it the moment the game loads up. This is called non-linear sequencing, meaning the game is designed to where it expects the player to be able to go whenever, wherever, and they want, which creates a lot of inconsistency with the story, but also allows the player to progress how they want to. Larian obviously knows this, and that is why the story is delivered in multiple different avenues and is just mostly functional. Bioware obviously uses non-linear sequences as well, but Bioware limits it to things like the player chooses which location to go to first, but ultimately having to do everything. In Dragon Age Origins, the player can choose to do the Dalish, then Dwarves, then Circle, then Redcliffe, but doing it in any order doesn't change the story. Why Bioware does this is to have simply consistent storytelling and progression. The player will understand what needs to be understood by the game's story. Either one is fine, but it needs to be understood in the context of what it's trying to do, trying to achieve, and what it values. Larian wants to give the player the chance to pace the game how they want, while Bioware controls it a lot more so that the story can be told a lot better. And that's it. It's been a long video, a long time to write this. My intention with this video was simply to explain the difference between each studio, because not only is it interesting, but I find many people not really understand what the difference is between each studio beyond surface similarities. They're both cinematic presented studios. Oh, I guess they're literally the same or something like that. But again, those are only surface level similarities between the studios. They are ultimately different studios. And yeah, if you've enjoyed this, please perhaps consider liking, subscribing, and even commenting if you enjoyed this.